Hi, I'm John Nieuwenburg with W5 Business Coaching, and you're listening to the Tools of the Trade podcast.
Welcome, please welcome
to another episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast, your number one construction industry resource. Hear conversations with industry professionals to get the tools, stories, and advice that you need to set your career on fire. You're now streaming the Tools of the Trade podcast.
What's going on, friends? Welcome to episode number 29 of the Tools of the Trade podcast. Wow, 29 already. And that's just long form. That's not even including the 7 or so monthly toolbox talks, which I highly recommend you check out, all under the same name, all right where you found this episode. But wherever you're tuning in from, whether it's the car or you're walking, running, you're at work, you're at the gym, you're cooking a meal, I hope that I'm really earning your time here. Time is valuable. I hope I'm earning it. And thank you so much for dedicating 45 minutes to an hour of your time with me to get educated, to learn more about improving yourself or your business, or just to get more information about the construction industry. If you haven't heard my voice before, I am your host, Colin Toop, and as always, it is my job here to interview construction professionals to extract the stories you want and the tools that you need to set your career on fire and crush it in the construction industry. If you've listened to some of my past episodes in the last 5 or so, I've been having your questions answered on the podcast. So to ask one of my guests a question, simply head over to Instagram, follow @ToolsPodcast, constantly check my story, which I'm updating on a weekly basis to see who's coming up next. Leave a question when you see an upcoming guest that intrigues you, and I will do my best to have it answered when they come on the podcast. Guys, I also have one more ask of you. Leaving reviews for me on whatever platform you're listening from really helps my visibility and to grow the brand and the platform and continue to give back. You know, this is all me here. So no one really understands how the podcast algorithms work on Apple, Google, Stitcher. I don't even think Apple and Google know how their algorithm works. But what the general consensus in the podcast space is it's frequent episode releases, constant reviews, downloads, and subscriptions. So if you can please head back into the podcast app. Just hit the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. Leave me a nice review. And that really, really helps me climb the charts so that more people can get what they need. They can get the tools, they can get the resources, they can get the stories from others in the industry. So I really appreciate it. And just to wrap this up, I have one review here from Manny at Hardcore Renos. And he says, had a great time chatting construction with Colin. Please tune in and check out some great construction talk with a tradesperson that really does understand the industry. Thanks, Colin, and keep up the awesomeness. Well, thanks, Manny. And all I want to say to that is, where is my podcast invite onto your podcast? Don't forget about the little guys. I know your platform is a lot bigger than mine, but I'm over here waiting for that return invitation. Anyway, on to today's guest. Today's guest is business coach John Nieuwenburg of W5 Coaching. John is actually the one and only quote-unquote business coach that I've hired, and we worked together when I was building my first electrical company, so we go way back. But one of the things I really want to underscore here is that John is more than just a coach. His TED Talk on the cultural taboos of suicide and mental illness has been viewed over 175,000 times on YouTube alone. He's read well over 500 books, and what really amazes me most is how much of this knowledge John is able to retain and then quote or call upon with perfect context in the conversation. He does that quite a bit in these episodes, so listen for that. John is the former managing director of BC Liquor Stores, which is British Columbia, Canada's private liquor store branch, or I guess I should say the government-owned liquor stores. Out here in Ontario, we'll call it the LCBO, but I'm digressing here. The sales are in the range of $3.6 billion for a bit of context on what scale he was managing there. And he has been in the coaching space for over 24 years as a keynote speaker, business coach, leadership coach, executive coach, strategic plan facilitator. He's really worn all the hats in the coaching and mentorship realm. One of the things I asked John was how he's different than other coaches, or I guess more what the difference between a coach and a consultant is. And here's what he said to me. He said, I believe teaching a man to fish. This is the primary difference between coaching and consulting. Consultants provide solutions based on their expertise, often leaving their clients reliant on them. So here's a fish, take it and go. And as your coach, I will teach you what you need to know so that you will know what to do next time. Here's how you fish. So equipping people with the tools. And I love that. Here is what you can expect to come from this episode. The owner's dilemma of thinking versus doing, recurring revenue models for contractors, fixed mindset versus growth mindset, the low-hanging fruit that owners should start to pick from to transform their business, and much, much more. To get in touch with John, you can either head over to toolspodcast.com, where I have links for everything that's mentioned here, show notes, the transcription. It's really become quite comprehensive, so I recommend you checking it out because there's lots of additional information and always free downloads from my guests when they have them. And you can also find John's contact information there, as well as his website, which you can check out, which is w5coaching.com. That's the letter W, the number 5 coaching.com. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving it up for business coach, my friend, my first coach ever, the man, John Nieuwenburg. John, thank you so much for joining me on Tools of the Trade. For those listening, John was my very first business coach when I had my small electrical company in Vancouver. And he's also the first and only person to take me to a TED Talk, which was just a phenomenal experience. And we're going to get into a lot of really amazing stuff. I know firsthand that John is a first-class executive coach and business coach. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation, John. And thanks for joining me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Beautiful. So I'm going to start this podcast actually off with a quote.
Okay.
And that quote is from Steve Jobs. And it goes, "You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, or whatever." So John, how does that relate to your coach or your career, as a coach?
Man, I don't know if I've ever told you this story, but when I first started coaching in about 2004, I had an epiphany. I had a middle of the night, wake up, bolt upright kind of moment where I had some crystal clear insight about the wisdom of Steve Jobs. Wisdom or insight that he had there that I've always been a coach. I'm hardwired to be a coach. And it was in that moment of epiphany that I was able to connect the dots going backwards to all the kind of moments in my life that have led me to the place where I'm now a business coach. I've done lots of other things and it wasn't always called coaching, but that was, in fact, what I've always been doing. So thank you for starting with that question. That's an awesome, important insight for me.
Yeah, I read it and I thought, you know what? I've never heard this from John. And this is a common thread I'm noticing in a lot of these conversations I'm having with people, because I typically find people that are passionate about what they're doing. And what I'm noticing is a lot of people say, for example, this one woman, Daria, that I interviewed, she's a project manager. And she said, you know what? I liked all these various things throughout my career, but it always came down to managing a project, managing a birthday party, or managing this or that. And I like to start with those types of things because I feel as though people are constantly out there like searching really hard for their passion when it's probably underlying. It's more of a reflective
Yeah.
process that's going to bring it out.
Yeah, so what I've learned is that you know what your passion is when you're 8, 9, 10 years old. And whatever you were doing when you're 8, 9, 10 years old for fun without being asked is very likely the backbone of your passion. So Daria, I'm sure, was the kind of person who had projects when she was 8 years old. And so when you think about what is my passion, what is my why, what am I here to deliver, think about that. And my version of that story is that when I was around 12 or so years old, I'm the eldest of 8 children. And so when I was around 10, 12, 13, 14, I'd collect my brothers and sisters' library cards. The library in my neighborhood was around 3 miles from my house. So I'd ride out to the library. I'd pick age. My youngest sister is 12 years younger than I am. So I'd pick age and interest appropriate books for all of them, bring them back, distribute them. 3 weeks later, the books were due. I'd collect them all. Nobody asked me. I just did it because that's how I'm wired. And that was kind of one of the moments of connecting the dots backwards. And today I kind of feel like I do a lot of that. I don't pass out books, but I make lots of book recommendations and
Yeah.
lots of tips and tools and tricks that are, meant to support people. One of the things people appreciate about me is that I've always got some kind of reference or tool or some suggestion that helps them in that circumstance.
Yeah, for sure. I remember my binder that I had running of all the handouts and notes that I would take when we had our calls together. And unfortunately, you know what? I think the sad part of our relationship, John, was mentally, I don't think I was ready to receive the coaching that you were giving me. And
Hmm.
at that point, that's something that I want to touch on in this is I think when you start a business, you want to figure a lot out for yourself and you think that you know a lot. It's almost like a teenager coming home to their parents. Oh, I know everything. You don't have to tell me. And I feel as though there may have been a bit of that in our personalities when we were coaching with you. I think what came out of that, my realization was I'm going back through this material recently that you had left me, and I was like, he was right the whole time. Why did I stop?
Well, you remind me. One of my favorite ever books is East of Eden. So I've read it in my teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and every time I read it, I admire how much smarter the author is. John Steinbeck is the author's name. And so what you bring to it when you're 20 and 30 and 40 and 50, you have that much more life experience. And so you recognize more of the wisdom that was available there when I was 15 and reading it for the first time, but didn't have the breadth of experience to recognize just how powerful the lessons were that he had in that book. And I think that I'm interpreting you to say something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say for sure. John, I wanted to know what exactly a coach is. Now, we have coaches, we have consultants, we have executive coaches and business coaches and personal coaches, and it just seems like everybody's a coach in some capacity these days. So, what type of coach are you, and what does it mean to be a coach versus a consultant?
Yeah. So I like to go to a reference that I think comes from the Bible, and that is that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. So a consultant is in the business of giving you a fish. A coach is in the business of teaching you how to fish. So transferring the skill so that you walk away with that skill. A consultant performs the work. A coach is on, like the metaphor, I'm on the sidelines. You, the owner of the business, goes on to the pitch. You turn to me when you're looking for guidance and help and tools and that kind of thing, but ultimately you do the work. And so that's the primary distinction. There's lots of different styles of coaching. Executive coaches tend to be people that provide services for people in corporate Canada, corporate America, larger businesses. As a business coach, I work with smaller businesses. In my case, they're around 5 to 10 million, sometimes, a million to 10 million. But business coaches also work with people that are in the 20 to 100 million kind of businesses as well. I've got the niche that I work with. So the thing about coaching and the thing that you kind of imply in what you just said is that it's a bit of the Wild West. And what I mean by that is anyone can hang a shingle and be a coach. And what exactly does it mean? I think the coaching as a profession would benefit if we started to get to a place where we did what other professionals do, which is lawyers and accountants and architects go to university, get a 7-year training, and then they have to satisfy a board approved exam. You got to pass the bar, you got to pass your articles, you got to get your PAng if you're an engineer. And so you get an education first, and then you got to prove to the profession that you're capable. And I think the coaching profession, as it matures, will get to that place as well. Being a coach has some kind of stamp of credibility with it.
Now, I know that some coaches go for designations and some people look for those specific styles or weekend courses or month-long courses that a coach has taken. Do you think that that is important, or do you think that it should be like a standard form of education through a university or college?
I think it's going to eventually evolve to that. That might take a generation or something before we get to that place. What clients want to know, to be honest with you, I don't often get asked about what level of certification I've had. But what I do with clients and prospects is that I show them a framework. I show them a model of how we work together. And so when they see that, they get to understand and get some comfort from the idea that we aren't sitting around doing, sort of alms or touchy feely things or socks and sandals. There's actually a system and a process, and one that can be repeated and robust. And I don't make it up every day, right? There's a framework that we use all the time, and so when clients or prospects see that, they appreciate that, as I say, robust and predictable, and as a result, they're not as concerned about whatever accreditation it might have.
Gotcha. So if we just rewind the clock, sort of my last backtracking question is, what was your professional experience before you got into coaching? So obviously you had this bolt up moment in the middle of the night where you thought of Steve Jobs and you realized that that was your thing. But what gave you the professional experience to know so much about business? Was it self education or was it your career path?
So, if I do it in chronological order, my first real job after university was in a national menswear retailer called Tip Top Tailors. So I was in Winnipeg, and I, was a sales guy on the floor. And over the course of 17 years, I grew through the ranks and eventually was a executive working out of head office in Toronto. So I grew from being a store manager and having P&L responsibility for a store, and then eventually a region, which was, at one stage like 6 stores and eventually like 10 stores. And then I became an area director, and that was for 50, 60 stores. And so even though it was a corporate setting, retail is very much about a collection of stores, and each store was its own sort of P&L. And that was a really good training background to become business oriented. Tip Top really was advanced for the times. There was a high level of computer reporting, key performance indicators. Managers were expected to develop their own P&L, at least in the areas that the manager was responsible for. So it was a fantastic training ground. I mentioned I was living in Toronto, which I didn't really like living in Toronto. I much preferred living in Vancouver. And so in 91, I got myself headhunted. I was recruited, and I joined the BC liquor stores. So I eventually became the president of the BC liquor stores. And to give you a sense of scale, it today does about 3 billion in revenue. About a
Wow.
billion of that is profit or transfer to the provincial treasury. It has about 200 stores and about 4,000 full-time equivalents. So that was kind of, executive corporate leadership. And after a while, I wanted to change from that, and I did a bit of retail consulting, but ultimately found the coaching model, and was delighted when I discovered that. And that's the kind of the high watermarks or the high points of how I got from here to there.
There you go. I love that story, actually. What does W5 stand for? I don't remember or know if you've actually ever told me.
I told you about connecting the dots. One of the dots was in the early 80s while working for Tip Top. I told you Tip Top was really advanced. We were taught something called the Socratic method of leadership. So Socrates had it that the best way to help somebody or lead someone is to help them figure it out for themselves. And the way you do that is by guiding them through asking questions to help them figure out what their options are and possibilities. And ultimately, the goal or the thing that we were expected to do is to help the person we were working with, our store manager or regional manager, to arrive at a conclusion that they owned, that was theirs, because we were not in the you should business.
Right.
So to get back to your question, what is W5? So the Socratic method is about asking great questions, and the 5 core questions all start with a W: who, what, when, where, why. So
Ah,
that's the connection.
got it. Got it. Clever. I like that a lot. So we've talked about what the difference between coaching and consulting is, and I know that we went through our own process when you onboarded us for coaching back in the day. But I was curious what you do when you're onboarding somebody for the first time. A business owner approaches you and says, "John, I want you to coach me." What are you looking for, and what sort of tools or methodologies do you deploy to really deconstruct that person and understand where their weaknesses are and where they need to start improving?
So typically, my best clients are people that are very motivated. They're not looking for motivation, although they get motivation out of the process. They're really high performers typically, but they're in a world where, in your case, where you're good at your craft, good at your trade, you've got training, you became journeyman, and yet you've never had a business education. And so I work with a lot of health practitioners, PhD folks, and believe it or not, those folks, and they've got 7, 8, 10 years of university training, and the people in the construction industry have the same problem. They're really good at their craft. They're good plumbers, electricians, they're good physiotherapists or neuropsychologists. I've got a client who's a neuropsychologist, like smart as a whip. But so what I do is I help provide a business education, which is how to run your business in a way that produces a better outcome for you in your life. So typically, the owners I work with are expressing frustrations or problems in one of or all three of the following areas. So they're typically saying, I'm around time, team, and money. So they're saying things like, I've got too much to do and not enough time to do it. I can't get everything done. If I don't do it, it won't get done. So lots of owners are, challenged with the silver penny syndrome. It's hard to get focused. It's hard to stay focused because it always feels like you've got 92 things to do. And so they're looking for help in staying focused. With team, they're often saying things like, I can't hire the right team. I don't have the culture I want. I can't get them to do the work at the level I need. And so they want some help with that. And then money has got two sides to it. So the first part of money is I need better accounting, financials, reporting, a dashboard, metrics to measure the results. And the other side of money is I need more money. I need better sales and marketing. Typically, there's always a kind of a high wire act when you start with a client. And what I mean by that is, on one hand, we are asking the question of what do you want this business to look like in about a year's time? What is the business plan? What is the strategic plan? What are we trying to accomplish? And yet, often when I get started with a client, they've got a burning bush or there's a fire truck at the door. One of my early clients gave me this lesson because in those days it was a bit sort of idealistic. Let's get the strat plan together, and we spent some time working on it. And then he kind of looked at me and said, "Well, I can't make payroll today." It's like, oh, the hell are we talking about strategic plan for?
No kidding.
And so I learned the lesson that coming back to your question is that in the beginning I've got to work with the client, and the client works with me to help me understand what are the immediate problems, the burning bushes that need to be taken care of, and get them resolved before we can move on to the sort of the bigger picture and what are we trying to get done here. And to kind of conclude on your question, how do we get started? So I use at least three different benchmarking tools that an owner completes on their own as a way to evaluate their business against a kind of a list of kind of an audit, self audit of their business to identify what's working well in the business, where they want some help. And that gives us the framework of what we should be paying attention to first.
Do you still run personality profiles on your clients to see where their personality falls?
Yeah, so what you're probably referring to is a thing called DISC,
Yep.
and DISC is a behavioral assessment tool. I'm going to make a fine distinction here, if that's okay, Colin.
Yes.
It's not really a personality tool, although that word you've meant it in a very generic kind of sense.
Okay.
DISC is meant to help people evaluate their preferred way of communicating and decision making. And the goal of it is that, again, I'm going to make a Bible reference. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's a bad idea in the language of DISC because in the language of DISC, it shows that there are four primary behavioral styles, and each of them has a preferred way of making decisions and communicating. And if you're one style, you'd best shift your style to accommodate the other person's style so you become more effective as a communicator. So the platinum rule is do unto others as they prefer to be done unto. And so this is a really powerful tool in the world of selling because you want to understand the lens, the decision making style of the person that you're selling to. But you also want it, selling is really about persuading, and all of us as leaders, communicators, are persuading people every day to a point of view, to a thought. And so becoming better at understanding your preferred style, learning about other people's preferred styles, how they wish to be communicated with, and adjusting your style makes you more effective.
Interesting. It reminds me of a lot of different conversations I've been having recently about leadership and connecting with people and leading with emotional intelligence and things like that, and really understanding the people that you're having conversations with and practicing the active listening. And I think it's something that's overlooked quite a bit.
Yeah, so DISC helps in, there's, I think, nine Qs. EQ is one of them, IQ is another one that most people know. And the emotional quotient is got a bunch of subsections, but one of them is intrapersonal and the other is intrapersonal. And so DISC helps you get some insight about your intrapersonal, your own preferences when it comes to communication and decision making. And interpersonal is helping getting better at understanding where the other person's coming from.
Got it. Now, when I was thinking about what I wanted to get in terms of tools out of you, John, when I was thinking of this conversation, a few things came to mind, and a lot of them ended up following the path back to what one might call succession planning, which is essentially setting your business up to be sellable or having an exit strategy, which it seems like everything structure wise points in that direction at the end of the day. And one of the first things that came to mind for me was in terms of the thinking versus the doing. And one of the common things, and we already touched on it briefly, is as contractors, as medical professionals, whatever, we're really good at our craft.
Right.
And I have seen a ton of small to medium sized business owners that cannot get off the tools, so to speak. They're constantly running out into the field to either put the fire out or do the work themselves. And a lot of them can never seem to get out of that cycle, that trap.
Yeah.
So, how do you recommend people start to, whether it's shift their mindset or dig themselves out of that hole, because it's a huge issue and it's very hard to get out of for a lot of people?
Yeah. So I told you I used to do a lot of library or book recommendations. Let me make a book recommendation.
Please do.
There's a book by Michael Porter called The E Myth, and E is Entrepreneurial Myth. And the Entrepreneurial Myth is just because you're good at the technical work of your business doesn't mean you're good at the business of your technical work. Just because you're a good electrician doesn't mean you know how to run an electrician's business. And so Michael does a great job of illustrating the point you're making and helping point a path in how to get out of that trap you're describing. And the work I do as a coach is largely what's described in that book. So Sarah loves baking cherry pies. She loves it so much, she opens a bakery. Then she discovers just because she's good at baking doesn't mean she knows how to run a bakery. That's the difference. And so there's a couple of key insights that the book makes, one of which is that the contractor that you were just referring to is always working in the business, doing of the doing. And you'll stay in that place until you get to a place where you have discipline of working on the business. So when you're working in the business, you're working in your trade. When you're working on the business, you start to recognize your business is not just a job you own. It's actually an entity at arm's length from you, and that it has its own sort of identity. And if I put it in as simple terms as you can, you want to get your business to a place where it's the most powerful place that you can get your business, where you can have time and money freedom, which means that you have the freedom to choose how you spend your time and the money to be able to do that, whether it's going to the beach or opening a new business because you have those freedoms. You have to get to this place. So this is hypothetical, kind of metaphorical, but you, the business owner, have an opportunity once a week in which you have an hour to speak to someone in your business. And in that hour, you're going to learn enough to know what is and isn't working and to be able to diagnose what needs to be done about it. What would your business have to look like? How would you structure the business? So in that hour, you'd have enough metrics, key performance indicators. You would likely be talking to someone who's a general manager. And as a result, the business could operate on its own. And you then, as the owner, can then think of that business as an ATM machine. Because every quarter, every year, it's spitting out dividends to you, whether you're involved there or not. Now, if you want to be involved, well, that's the freedom you have. You can choose to do that, but it isn't necessary. And that's the big breakthrough that many business owners want to figure out how to do, but often feel trapped or stuck or know they're experiencing problems, but don't know how to act or change what they're doing to get to that other place.
Do you think it's fear of letting go, fear of delegation, fear of somebody else doing it, and that interim period of having to train them and them failing?
Well, fear is a big part of it. And part of that fear is many business owners are very poor at delegating. And so many business owners think of delegation as actually abdication. There is a fantastic website, businessballs.com. I don't know why it's called that, / how to delegate. So Google that, business balls, how to delegate, and there's a fantastic article there, like a core teaching article about how to properly delegate. And you, as the leader, if you're going to ever get to the place where the business operates without you, you have to become really good as a leader and really good at delegating. And a delegation ought to be operating at a level that it is the business and your people are performing at a level that is up to your standard, even if you're not there. That's what you want to achieve. It's hard to do. And business owners, you're probably have seen this. They get caught in a trap of, I can do it better. It takes too long to train the other guy. By the time I train the other guy, I could have done it 10 times. There's a trap there.
Yeah.
Or the other trap that often happens is they get into a world where it's a hub and spoke. And what I mean by that is the owner sees themselves as the hub of every activity in their business, and nothing happens in the business unless they're consulted with. And they then become the equivalent of the only air traffic controller at the busiest airport in the country. And they're pulling their hair out because they feel like, I'm stuck. How come these guys won't make a decision or do anything on their own? And here's the truth, Mr. Owner, Ms. Owner, you trained them to do that, because every time they come to you, they know you're going to give them the answer. And you're not capable of leading them in a way where they discover and are empowered to take ownership of the problem themselves. And that's the core of that skill, is what you want to learn as a business owner. So the next time someone comes to you and says, hey, what should I do here? Your response ought to be to answer with a question. And the question should sound like something like, tell me your best 2 ideas that you would, if I wasn't here, what are the best 2 things you could have done? What were your best 2 ideas? And one of those 2 is likely pretty good, and empower them to do it. Okay, great. Do that one. I agree. Which kind of flips the script. Don't give them the answer. Cause them, this is the Socratic method, cause them to figure it out. And so over time, if you do that thousands of times in 1-minute increments, they'll come to a place where they're now much more capable of self-leadership and empowerment to do the work that up until now they just leaned on you like a crutch.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a rant, Colin. Sorry about that. I'm pretty impassioned about this thing.
No, you know what? I think it's a much needed rant because everybody struggles with it, in my opinion. Even personally, I struggle with delegation still to this day. I think it's something that's very hard to get over. And that kind of led me into another thought I had. And this is a very personal thought. When I had my small electrical contracting company, it's easy to look to your left and your right and compare yourselves or yourself to your peers in your market. And it seemed as though at that point in time, we had a range of small electrical companies, small contracting
Yeah,
companies that were all popping up. And one of the things that I kept asking myself was, what is the difference between these companies that seem to be growing at 10x speed and taking on bigger and better clients, bigger and better contracts, employing more people, and looking on the surface? Obviously, this is optics. It's who knows what's going on under the hood, but they seem to be having this trajectory. And then you have the people that seem to be beating their head against the wall, and they can never get out of that loop. And I was wondering if you
yeah,
think that that's solely related to the delegation, or if there's other things at play that you typically notice prevent people from scaling.
yeah. So going back to the E-Myth, he talks about adopting the franchise model. So let me ask you a question, Colin. How do they get those French fries to taste the same, whether they're made in Hong Kong or Moscow or in your town? The French fries are made by someone who's likely 16 years old, and the parents of that 16-year-old can't get him or her to clean their bedroom. How do they do that?
System.
They've got great systems. And so the answer to your question is, systems run your business, people run your systems, you lead your people. When you get those 3 things right, you can scale 10x. Otherwise, if you don't have systems, people are running your business. And as people come and go, your business comes and goes on the quality of the people you're able to interact. So at McDonald's, they have great systems. Everything is systematized. Now, some people look at the McDonald's banner example and it's kind of so mechanical and it almost feels robotic. But here's the thing, they started in 1956, probably like 3 stores somewhere in, I think, Chicago it was. And their systems then don't in any way look like the systems that they now have when they're, I don't know, thousands of stores and billions of burgers, right? Systems scale at the level that you need in your business. The bookkeeping system you had in your business when it was 500,000 isn't going to look totally different than the bookkeeping system you have in your business when you're doing 500 million. So scaling, systematizing is an ongoing, ever evolving thing to meet the needs of your business. As your business scales, your systems have to scale with it. And if you don't, you're going to stay in the second category that you were described, stuck in a place because you can't outgrow your system.
And that's probably when you're doing that reflection time working on your business, it's probably a good time to start thinking about what system could be running those areas where you're having hiccups, where you're constantly losing traction.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, Colin. Don't look for a human solution, look for a system solution. And so when you see recurring mistakes or recurring bad outcomes are happening, rather than looking for a people solution, you look for the system solution. And the question you want to ask yourself is, what would the system have to look like so that problem couldn't happen again? And about 80% of what happens in a business ought to be at the level of routine or the level of systems. And about 20% is kind of an arbitrary number, but about 20% is the exception. And those exceptions get brought to the attention of the leadership. Everything else is done in a systematic way.
80/20 rule.
There's like a billion examples of the 80/20 rule.
Interesting. That just clicked for me right there.
Yeah.
Now, when we're talking about scaling a business and trying to make it valuable in the eyes of somebody that's going to purchase it from you, one of the things that you talk about in your blog posts is creating recurring revenue value. And in construction, typically, even at the major corporation level, you're purchasing a bidders list at that point in
Mm,
time. There is no guaranteed work in a construction company unless somehow you've locked down a 10-year maintenance contract somewhere.
yeah.
Now, how could you recommend people think about building value in other ways in construction?
So the most important or the most valuable kind of revenue, the most valuable kinds of sales is recurring revenue. And the reason these unicorns exist in Silicon Valley, the one that came to mind for me is Dropbox. Are you a user of Dropbox? They just processed my credit card for $150. It happened without even me knowing it. And it's going to happen year after year after year. So let me describe a company which is a security company. There's two of them. They both do $1 million. One of them does construction or installation of security systems. The other one does monitoring. They're both doing $1 million. The installation business is going to be worth about, assuming it's profitable, is going to be worth roughly 750,000. The monitoring business is going to be worth anywhere from 2 to 3 million. They both do $1 million, but one business, the monitoring business, once you give a credit card to your monitoring company, how often do you think you're going to change that? It just rolls every month on your credit card. So there's lots of different styles of recurring revenue. Think about Costco. In order to have the privilege of shopping at Costco, you have to pay $50 or $100 to be a member, right? The average Costco store has about 50,000 members. Without opening the door, they got $2.5 million in the bank, period. They have hundreds of stores. Think about how big that pot of money would be.
No kidding.
So another form of recurring revenue is the Gillette or the razor example or the coffee pot example. So you buy the razor, you buy the Nespresso machine, and now you're kind of hooked to them to have to replenish the blades, replenish the pods, and now you're in their ecosystem and kind of, on a recurring basis, you're always showing up. Magazine subscriptions, another form of recurring revenue. Harley Davidson charges $49 to 100 million people to be part of the Harley Davidson Club, for which you get a T-shirt and the ability to walk down the street and say, I'm one of these hog guys.
Oh, wow.
So you're right. The toughest kind of business to be is in where you're what you kill what you eat. Every day you get bids. You have to compete on bids. There's I told you about books. One of the great ones is a book called Sales Differentiation. It's a hard word to spell, by Lee Salz, Salz, 19 different strategies to compete to win business without price competition. That's the subtitle. And he's got lots and lots of different examples of how you can differentiate. Kind of a related thing to recurring revenue is a USP, unique selling proposition.
Hmm.
And the definition of a USP is people choose to do business with you despite your price, not because of. You don't want to compete on price. If all you're competing on is price, there's only one direction that competition can go, to the basement, to the floor. And so you want to alter the ecosystem in the bidding world so that you tilt it in your favor. So the construction business is definitely bid oriented, but there's lots of strategies. Let me point you at the direction of something. Win Without Proposals, a website. Win Without Proposals. And the guy's got brilliant advice on how to change the dynamic of how proposals are done. He comes from an agency, a marketing kind of advertising kind of background, but the principles can be applied if you think about the principle and how do I shift that to make it work for my business.
And for anybody listening, John's just been dropping knowledge like crazy here. So we're going to link to everything on the website. So don't worry about trying to write everything down. You can head to toolspodcast.com and I will post all those resources because this is bringing back similar feelings of John just throwing books at you every 5 minutes and websites. I love it.
Hey, Jim Rohn has a wonderful saying about this. Don't wish it was easier, wish you were better. Work harder on yourself than you do on your business. Work harder on yourself. And so you can't out earn your learning. The smarter you get, the more you have the ability to grow. I'm going to coach you a little bit right now, if that's okay, Colin.
Please do.
What does the average middle class person think you do with money?
Spend it.
Yeah. And do you know the story of the average person who wins the lottery, $5 million lottery, and 5 years later they're
Broke.
because the middle class person, their mindset about money is it's for spending,
Spending. Yep.
paying bills. What does Warren Buffett think about money?
Cash is king. He sits on a huge pile of cash.
He doesn't work for money.
Yeah.
Money works for him. That is a massive shift in mindset. If you gave him $5 million, well, nowadays he's 85, he might buy a boat or something. But I'm kidding here. But he would think about, how do I employ this money to work for me? That sounds simple, what I've just said, but it's a massive shift in how you think about money. So the average employee earns a salary. A self-employed person makes money. That's a different word. A business owner receives profit. We're talking about business owners because they have a business and it's at arm's length. It's acting as an ATM machine. A investor thinks about return on investment, and the entrepreneur level, Warren Buffett level, doesn't work for money. Money works for them. Those are three massive shifts in mindset that can take you down the track of how you think about money is how you earn money. And you can't get to the next level until you make the shift in how you think about it.
Mhm.
Back to your question.
I mean, that's in construction, like you mentioned, it requires that out of the box thinking to think of how can we create that recurring revenue model or that value stream that is going to be so much different than the competition, because that's another thing you talk about is being different. And in construction, on the surface, we all look the same. We all drive vans, we all pull wire and smack up 2x4s and put roofs on houses, but what's making you different than everybody else? Like, why would I want to buy your services over the next guy? I mean, Google reviews don't even do it anymore because there's 50 companies with Google reviews, around 50 or 60 reviews, 5 stars. So
Yeah.
where do you go?
Well, the better you can answer that question, the more you will be able to thrive and set your own prices, period. I know it sounds daunting, and you may challenge me and think that that's not possible. One of the stories Lee Salz tells is he lives in Minnesota. It's cold in the winter, and he lets the dog out the backyard all winter long. And as you can imagine, in the spring, there's a mess that needs to be cleaned up. So he hires a service to do this every spring, and they clean it up. And the way this guy's service worked, at the end, when he collected all the garbage bags, he'd give it to Lee, and Lee would put it in the garage that sat in the garbage cans in the garage for 2, 3 days until the garbage truck came by. And that's how things were done. So I don't know, after 3-4 years, Buddy wasn't available anymore. So he does a Google search. He finds another service that does the same thing. And the service provider collects all the dog poo in the back, and Lee goes out to meet him, and Lee says, well, give me the bags, I'll put it in the car. And Buddy with the service business says, no, I'll take it to the dump for you. And Lee was gobsmacked that here was a point of difference. He would have happily paid additional for that service because it provided something. So USPs don't have to be massive things. That point of difference was enough for Lee to pay the second provider a higher fee for that incremental service. So he lived in, as I say, Minnesota, and he lived on a green belt. So on the back of the yard was some kind of forest or something, and there was a massive storm, a bunch of trees went down, and he hires he gets three companies to bid on it, and they're all bidding, and one says 2,000, one says 5,000, one goes walking around the lot for an hour and comes back, he's 20,000, and their bids were like handwritten on a piece of foolscap. Like, how do I differentiate? Should I go 2, 5, 20? I might as well go two. I don't have no idea why I should be paying 20. Now here's the thing. It was the insurance company paying for it. It wasn't even Lee's own money. If the 20,000 or the 5,000 guy could have given any kind of story that was believable about why it was worth 5,000 instead of 2, they would have got the business.
Right.
But instead they make themselves commodities. The three of them just presented themselves as a commodity without any differentiation, without a USP. So we provide a disservice for ourselves if we don't learn the lesson of how to get a unique selling proposition.
It almost seems like it would be a good exercise to run through all of your sales funnels and how each of those sales is executed to look for those critical junctures. Like we typically get to this point in a build or in a service call where we could be adding that extra piece of value in for somebody.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a process to do this, to develop your own USP. If you Google the phrase "how to develop a USP," Google's got lots of tools to do that. They're hard to do on your own, and lots of times you need some help in developing a USP. And of course, if you want some help, I know some people that can help you.
Well, we'll definitely get to linking all your information in this as well. So if anybody is intrigued by what you're saying, I'm sure that they would be happy to reach out. John, the last place I wanted to go quickly before we get into some wrap up questions here is in terms of accountability. So if you're coming at a business alone, it's a little different than coming at it with a business partner. And obviously there's
Yeah.
pros and cons. And if you don't have a coach, you may find it hard to hold yourself accountable. And I was curious if you had any tips on how people can start to learn to hold themselves accountable to do the things they said they were going to do in their business.
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of different resources, one of which is, let me recommend Atomic Habits by James Clear. There's another book for you. But here's the first thing you have to come to appreciate: no matter how much discipline or willpower, Colin, you have, or in fact, I have, none of us have enough. Willpower and discipline is an easily exhausted resource. And so we have to build structures around ourselves in order to build systems that create accountability for us. So one of those is to have an accountability partner or a coach, because that person holding ourselves accountable to a third party gets us to show up, and we want to stay in integrity. And it's not very comfortable showing up for your coaching session or your accountability buddy and have to start making excuses. But let me give you some different examples about structure or systems to hold you accountable. So let me give you the hypothetical scenario of two people who are about to lose weight, want to lose some weight. One of the two says, you know what, I'm just going to be more careful with what I eat and make better choices at lunchtime and not eat the second banana split. And, I'm just going to be more careful. The other person gets an app. And that app records all of the calories, records all the exercises, gives feedback on heart rate and condition, etc. Which of those people is more likely to be successful?
I'm thinking of this personally because I've done both, and I don't know. I'm thinking the person with the app, but I'm also thinking that maybe that's too much work.
Yeah, so you need an appropriate system, but the one with structure will always perform at a higher level. Now, what you've just said is the system you selected may have been too complex or wasn't ideally suited for your situation, but the fact that just even getting a spreadsheet or a habit tracker, just make a list of all the habits you wish to adopt, days of the week, and write an X next to each that you do every day. That only takes like 2 seconds,
Yeah.
right? Well, 2 minutes, 5 minutes a day. There's lots of versions of systems. So the bridge between the habit you have today and where you want to get to can only partially get started with willpower. The bridge ultimately has to be a system or a structure. There's other ways you can do it. One of the strategies you can employ is a thing called habit stacking. And what I mean by that is you embed habits inside of some other habits that you've already got. So, a personal story is that I'm not real good with flossing. I hate it. It's a pain in the
I don't think you're alone on that one.
no, and so I was always never really good about it, and my wife had nagged me about it, and then I got a battery-powered water pick. So now I'm in the shower, and every one of us has a routine in the shower, and one of those routines is I stuck in the middle of it using the water pick. And now it just happens in the same way. If you think about your shower routine, you can do that mindlessly. Some of the best ideas we have is because we free the brain in that period to have those creative thoughts. So habit stacking is another way that you can build in structure to help you with that motivation gap or the discipline gap, willpower gap that I've been referring to. So, regardless of who you are, having an accountability system or an accountability partner, I have a coach. Why? Because I know it works for me. I don't want to show up in my coaching session and not having completed what I said I was going to do the last time we met because it's embarrassing as hell. I don't want to have that happen. So, at the very least, I just avoid the pain of the embarrassment. And in the meantime, the business keeps moving forward. Business owners are often very lonely. You have competitors, you can kind of chat at industry events. You have a spouse, but often it takes a long time to explain things to the spouse before they kind of get what you're talking about. You have people in your business, but you can't really let your hair down with many of those people, and that's what lots of business owners appreciate having a coach for that reason. Someone who can be their voice of reason, someone who they can confide in, and someone who holds them accountable.
This brings up another thing that I almost forgot to speak about, which was something that we're dealing with in construction that I've been having a lot of conversations around lately, and that is passing knowledge on. And the term that comes around a lot is when somebody retires without passing their knowledge on, you're burning a book, because they have a whole career of learning that specific field that doesn't get passed on to anybody else. And then you have a whole generation coming up, especially in construction. We got 40% baby boomers retiring. We've got young people coming up in the industry that aren't going to have those same mentorship opportunities unless more people step up to the plate and say they're willing to do that. So if somebody's listening to this right now and they're approaching that phase of their career, their life, whether they're younger or older, it doesn't matter, and they're thinking of starting to give back, how would you recommend they start looking into coaching in some capacity?
Well, I thought you were going to ask me a different question.
Which was that?
That how do we document or otherwise pass on the knowledge that exists in the world of that experience and pass it down? Well, in trades, a lot of that is documented in becoming a journeyman. It's documented. There's a system. What often happens is that companies aren't very good at documenting their best practices, which is what I think you're asking. How do we extract or otherwise obtain that information from all those years of experience and record it in some fashion so that it can get passed along? Those are things called standard operating procedures. Those are all the documentations, all the systems, all the internal company wikis that are all designed to make it less about the brain or the person, pardon me. Systems run the business, people run the system. If you've got that person who's retiring and all that knowledge exists in that person, it expires when that person leaves.
Mm-hmm.
We have to systematize that understanding. But back to your other question, how does someone become a coach?
Yeah, and let me kind of rephrase that a bit because I'm talking specifically about a few people I've talked to that are approaching retirement. They're semi-retired. They're looking to become that coach slash mentor, either within their company currently or outside their company, and they almost don't have the courage to do it. They don't have the courage. They don't think. They don't realize how much they have to give, and they don't realize how many people could use that knowledge and leverage it. So they're having a hard time figuring out, how do I take the stuff outside of an SOP that's just like 40 years of getting beat up in construction and give that to somebody else?
The day I made the decision to become a coach, I needed to sign a contract that was a lot of money involved. I remember sitting on my couch and I was vibrating in fear, scared to make the commitment. And, it's one of the better decisions I've ever made in my life. And so, courage is the ability to act in the face of fear, not in the absence of risk. So, it takes commitment, and courage is not the recognition there's nothing to be afraid of, but to recognize there's something more important. I was trying to remember the exact quote. And so, for the right person, they're going to be so compelled, so interested in learning or passing along their knowledge that they're going to move forward despite the fear. Now, there can be systems and mechanisms to help cross that bridge. It's not like you have to look over the Grand Canyon and decide you're just going to jump off the canyon. There are ways that you can build a bridge so that it isn't a jump off the canyon, but a bridge to the other side of the canyon. And you can become a mentor, which is a more informal way of coaching, and just simply make yourself available to people that regard you as holding that level of wisdom and agree on some kind of routine or of meeting and communicating. You can become a consultant. You can become a coach. There's lots of different ways that you can scratch that itch. But the one thing that I would say is that everyone who becomes effective as a coach or a consultant or a mentor is hardwired to be a teacher. In high school, I knew I wanted to be a teacher, which is essentially the style of coaching I do. And in high school, the idea of in those days, the teachers walked around with Harris tweed coats and elbow patches. So that style of institutional teaching didn't really work for me. So one of the lessons I got is, like, for example, if I'm a pretty good golfer. I'm like a 10 handicap, which is not pro level by any means. I'm not even good as an amateur, but a decent golfer. If you go golfing with me, I got to clamp my mouth not to offer you golf tips because I'm hardwired to be a teacher, man. And I learned a lesson from my brother who I was golfing with, who looked at me and kindly said to me, "John, thanks a lot, but I don't want your advice." And that was a gobsmacking moment for me when I realized just because I had some tips didn't mean that it was welcome. And so, that's kind of a roundabout way of saying you've got to have an audience, you've got to have pupils, you've got to have people willing to take your advice, open to taking your advice, and you, the person, have to be willing and hardwired to be that person who provides teaching and advice.
Well, thank you. And I know that you are part of a coach's coaching. Is it a platform, or talk a little bit about that in case somebody's interested in getting coaching from a coach?
Yeah, so I'm involved in a thing called My Coach's Coach, mycoachescoach.com. And it's a sort of an ecosystem of tools and strategies to help coaches get their practice off the ground. So if you go to mycoachescoach.com, one of the things that's available there is a 30-day free trial to the entire ecosystem in back office. And for 30 days, fill your boots, go have a look at it, decide if it's for you. And if it isn't, that's great. Just make a note to yourself 28 days later to pull your credit card details. And if you do, then you might want to get involved. It's the protocol I use to work with my clients, as well as my regular business clients, as well as the platform that I use to help other coaches become better as coaches, not just as coaches, but to have better coaching businesses, coaching practices. There's a few of these kinds of platforms out there, but the one that I'm involved with and going to recommend is My Coach's Coach.
Beautiful, thank you. And again, we're going to link to that. And John, I just wanted to end this interview with a couple questions. I know that we're approaching the hour, but there's a few things that I really wanted to ask you.
Fire away.
The first one is, what's your favorite bottle of wine and why?
Oh man, my favorite bottle is probably the one I had last.
Okay. Which was that?
I drink a lot of Shirazes and Zinfandels, so I like big, robust, heavy flavor mouth bombs full of wine. So the one that comes to mind for me right now is one from California called The Prisoner. If you're drink a lot of European or French wine, they tend to be a little bit smoother and softer. And so if that's your style of wine, you're going to find that this one's like being hit with a sledgehammer. But it's great with steaks on the barbecue and big heavy meals because it acts as a nice counterpoint.
I'm gonna have to try that. My second question is, who is Seth Godin, and why do you like Seth so much?
Seth Godin is a guy who's been writing a blog for decades. And I get an email from him every day. And it's welcome in my inbox because at least 4 out of 7 emails provides a bit of insight or a lesson or a learning that I use myself or pass along to my clients. So I like him because he helps me get smarter. So spam by definition is email that is unwelcome, but his is welcome because it creates value for me every day. And so that's the definition of the kind of marketing that's always welcome in your inbox.
And I was going to ask you what your favorite books are, but you've left so many books out here for us to think about. So I think we'll avoid that question unless there's something that you really want to mention.
I do. So when I meet with people, I tell them I've read 500 books. A little bit of trivia. I've read 500 books, which may sound like a lot, but if you read 10 books a year, I'm 66. So if I read 10 books a year for 50 years, you get to 500 in a hurry. And I'm not counting the books I read prior to the age of 16. I'm pretty comfortable with the 500 number because at one stage in my life, I threw out over 1,000 paperbacks. So I don't know if I read all of them, but 500 by minimum definition is. And so if the last book you read was the last time you left high school, your education doesn't stop when you leave school. It continues. And, just a strong believer in adult education, ongoing education, and the best education is the one that you choose and give to yourself. Go read a book.
So is there any books that you recommend outside of business that you've consumed, or do you consume strictly nonfiction?
99% of what I read is related to business, but it also takes on the spectrum of leadership and personal development. So the realm of getting smarter about how business works and how we as people work.
Gotcha. And the last thing I wanted to ask you, John, is you are doing such a good service for business owners in the world by giving them a reason to push harder and to be successful and to get the most out of their businesses and regain control of their lives. And I know that you have a coach yourself as well, but outside of coaching, who is that person or what is that force that allows you to show up to be your best self in the world every day? Why do you show up and deliver all of this to people? Like, it's a very philanthropic almost attitude you have to have as a coach. Like, what drives you to be that way?
I'm hardwired to be a teacher. And so the money I make from my coaching practice is important and, as a kind of a scorecard in that. But ultimately, the payoff for me as a coach is the self actualization, the reward and satisfaction I get from watching others grow, to see people grow, businesses grow. And the way I measure myself in that respect is I have a BHAG. So that's a good to great statement, big, hairy, audacious goal. So my big, hairy, audacious goal is at the day that I retire, I intend to have a retirement party and I'm going to invite all of my clients. And my goal is to have 100 clients volunteer to travel to come to that retirement party because they recognize or appreciate how much of a difference I've made for them in their lives and their families. And so the test I hold myself to is I'm just going to send out an invitation. If they appear, it'll be a validation of what I've just described. And if they don't, then I've failed in delivering my BHAG. So my BHAG is to help 100 families get a better life because they've got a better business.
Amazing. I think that's a perfect place to wrap this up. Is there anything else you want to leave the construction world behind or the world in general behind with before we sign off and get your contact info?
Well, the first thing that came to mind for me is all leadership starts with self-leadership. And so if you want to be a better leaders for others, you have to become a better leader yourself in leading yourself. So I don't know why that came to mind, but it's been on my mind these days. So let me leave you with that as a parting thought, or as Jim Rohn said, work harder on yourself than you do on your business.
Beautiful. I love it so much, John. Thank you so much. If anybody's looking to get in touch with you for coaching or otherwise, where's the best place for them to reach you?
W5coaching.com, W5, and John at W5coaching.com, or LinkedIn, John Nieuwenburg. You can find me Twitter on W5Coaching. Those are lots of ways to reach out to me. John at W5coaching.com is bulletproof.
Perfect. And if you're listening to this, of course, you can hit thetoolspodcast.com and you can click directly on this episode and get the full bio of John and all of the links to everything that we mentioned in this episode, all the books and websites and resources and great stuff, and John's contact info as well. So, John, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I had a lot of fun. It was great to catch up, and I look forward to speaking again in the near future.
It was my pleasure, and I had as much fun as you did. Appreciate the opportunity.
That's a wrap. That's a wrap, everybody.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Tools of the Trade podcast. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review. For show notes, blog posts, resources, and access to our newsletter, check out toolspodcast.com.